So allow me to welcome you virtually again to the Purawood Center for our third lecture of the winter quarter on Iranian antiquity. Having just explored early in January in a brilliant lecture delivered by Professor Howard Johnson, The Last Grade of Antiquity, fought between the Sasanian and Byzantine empires, to transition into the role of Greek concubines in the mercenary army of Cyrus the Younger in an exciting talk held by our dear colleague, Professor John Lee. Having explored all of this, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Professor Eberhard Sauer, in whose company we shall once more move to the Sasanian world, more explicitly to explore the outer defensive installations of the Sasanian Empire. Dr. Sauer is Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh and one of the directors of two separate but thematically interlinked fieldwork projects in Iran and Georgia. Since 2012, he has been the principal investigator of the Persia project funded by the European Research Council, which had been involved with fieldwork on Sasanian military monuments in Iran, Georgia, and Oman. Professor Sauer's research is highly comparative and has been focusing lately on the interplay between the Roman and Sasanian empires, notably the defensive walls in northern Iran, among them the Gorgan Wall, which he and his collaborators have identified as the longest fault-line barrier of the late antique world. Before turning his attention to the material remains of the Iranian world, Dr. Sauer had published extensively on the nexus of religion, epigraphy, and archaeology, and undertaken extensive fieldwork in the Roman world, more notably on a Claudian military base in Oxfordshire, which might have been a good omen for his later work on the military installations of the Sasanian Empire. His earlier publications bear witness to his wide-ranging interests, be it his opulent and excellent study on the end of paganism in the northern western provinces of the Roman Empire, published in 1996, or be it the more recent coins, cult, and cultural identity, Augustan coins, hot springs, and the early Roman baths at Bourbon, Levant, published in 2005. His important work on the Sasanian Empire is in particular reflected in the collaborative project undertaken with our great colleagues in Iran, namely the Great Wall of Gorgan and Frontier Landscapes of Sasanian Iran, published in 2013, which really brought attention to the massive defensive brick walls of Gorgan and Tamişe that stretched all the way from the Caspian Sea in the west over 200 kilometers to the east, a major imperial venture to ward off the Hephtalite danger, and was possibly initiated by Yazgir II and brought to fruition under Peruz in the 5th century of the Common Era. The Gorgan Wall that had necessitated substantial imperial resources to build, maintain, and arm was bestowed with some 30 fortifications along the wall, as well as a handful of sizable base camp that procured an estimated 30,000 standing troops to guard. His most recent publication on the Caspian Gates in the Caucasus, from antiquity to the age of the Huns and the Middle Ages, is completing our comprehension of the defensive system of the Sasanians. By paying heed to the Dariali Gorge in the Caucasus and the remains of Sasanian fortifications that controlled Transcaucasian traffic, but also expanded the empire's fortifications against Hunnic invasion in the Caucasus. These joint projects in Georgia and northern Iran have revealed the extraordinary scale and sophistication of the Sasanian military infrastructure and shed new light on its purpose and effectiveness. And we are most excited to learn about them in the hour that follows. Before welcoming Dr. Sauer, however, allow me just to thank briefly his teams, both in Iran and Georgia, who have graciously allowed him to present the results of the collaborative fieldwork to the scholarly community. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sauer.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Shayegan, Dr. Stevens, for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to speak to the Purawood Center for the Study of the Iranian World. What I will present to you are indeed the results of our European Research Council project, focused most notably on Georgia. This research has been carried out jointly with my colleagues in Iran, most notably Dr. Shebral Nokande, the director of the National Museum of Iran, Hamid Omrani Rekavandi of the Great Gorgan Wall base, Lana Chologauri and David Nashkidashvili of Tbilisi State University, Mehdi Musavinya of Nishapur University, Muhammad Reza Nemati of the Iranian Cultural Heritage, Handcraft and Tourism Organization, who have all jointly with me explored sites in Iran, and many others who will feature in the acknowledgements at the end of this lecture. What you see in this introductory slide is the Sasanian Empire in the late 6th and early 7th century, and some of the sites that you will hear about, most notably, and I hope you can see my cursor, Dariali Fort in the central Caucasus, and Kali Iraj near modern Tehran, a cluster of fortifications in the Gorgan Plain, Gabri Calais, the Gorgan Wall, Kalepol Gonbat, and I will also very briefly refer to the Fulaj Fort in Oman, and I should mention here that the research there was done, most of it was done by Professor Al-Javari of Muscat University, as well as Dr. Seth Priestman and Dr. Derek Kennett. Now, we had the idea about 17 years ago that it would be a good idea to attempt to date the Gorgan Wall via the application of scientific techniques. At this time, we were not sure what the exact date of the Gorgan Wall was. And in 2005, we succeeded via radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence dating to date the Gorgan Wall to the 5th or early 6th century. On historical grounds, it seems much more likely that it was in the 5th century that the Gorgan Wall was built. Indeed, our more recent research, which suggests that multiple phases of activity have taken place by the early 6th century, does suggest very strongly that the origins of this building project are very likely to go back to the 5th century rather than having started as late as the 6th century. So the brick kilns, about which we will hear more, yielded our earliest dating evidence for the construction of the Gorgan Wall, as well as material from the forts. So what will I cover today? So these are the essential themes of today's lecture. We will first of all look at the river frontier. The Gorgan Wall was being the longest fort-lined barrier in the late antique world, was not the earliest installation to exist in the Gorgan Plain. So we will look at the evolution of defensive architecture in the Gorgan Plain. We will then move on to the Great Wall of Gorgan and also briefly discuss other walls in the north of the Sasanian Empire. We will look at very large fortresses in the hinterland of these linear barriers. We will look at the use of natural barriers by the Sasanian Empire. And finally, we will come to some historical conclusions as to the scale and the purpose of Sasanian military investment. But first of all, let us look at the evolution of defensive architecture in the Gorgan Plain. Now, you see here, if you just focus on what is in red, various small forts along the Gorgan River, and our latest research does suggest that there was a chain of forts along the Gorgan River that probably predate the construction of the Gorgan Wall. The Gorgan Wall itself is this long black line which you see here in the north of the Gorgan Plain. We now also know that there are various fortresses in the hinterland of the Gorgan Wall, here highlighted in blue, at least some of which seem to be earlier, as our latest research suggests, than the Gorgan Wall itself. Notably Gabri Calais, about 600 meters across, massive fortification which is here, and it's possible that also Calais Talant, maybe later, maybe broadly contemporary. Calais Harabé is probably a little later than Calais Harabé, but may also be earlier than the Gorgan Wall. But we will first focus on the smaller forts in the hinterland, notably Burak Tepe. Burak Tepe is a fort of around 70 to 80 meters across, so comparatively small. If you look at this Corona satellite image on the top right of the screen, you see the Great Wall of Gorgan here. Two of the over 30 forts on the Gorgan Wall just behind it. 2 kilometers south of it, a massive campaign base, 650 meters across. Another 2 kilometers further south, there's this tiny dot here. You see it a bit clearer on this Google Earth image. This here is Burak Tepe, a small fort on a now dried up course of the old Gorgan River. Now, we decided to explore Gorgan Burak Tepe in 2015 to 2016, and we carried out a geophysical survey, which you can see on the left. We also carried out excavations, and if you're wondering what this round hole is, it's not that we adopted very unconventional excavation techniques, but when we arrived at the site, we found that robber trenches had been dug prior to our arrival, and we thought maybe it is a good idea to explore one of those robber shafts in order to minimize further damage to the archaeological structure and possibly also to reach the earlier occupation phases of this small fort more rapidly. It then turned out that this underground tunnel system dug by these private investigators was more extensive than we had anticipated, disturbing the stratigraphy towards the bottom of our trench, but nonetheless, we did gain a good insight into the history of occupation of this small fort and a series of radiocarbon dates, certainly proving that it dates to the 5th, 6th century, and also taking into account the examination of the pottery by Maria Dahmedji. It suggests that this fort is earlier than the Gorgan Wall, but was occupied in part together with it. So our conclusion, Burak Tepe may be part of an early 4th century chain of forts south of the Gorgan River. It's a typical courtyard fort, you see it here in reconstruction, built as of a type built very widely across the Sasanian and the late Roman world. So on the left, you see a selection of Sasanian fort. On the right, you see a selection of late Roman forts. Now, despite the fact that it was only about half the size of Fort 2 on the Gorgan Wall, about which we will hear much more in a moment, there appears to have been initially as much accommodation available in Burak Tepe, and it's possible that it may have had a garrison of broadly similar size, so maybe around 500 men. Later, after the construction of the Gorgan Wall possibly, occupation density based on our excavation seems to have fluctuated greatly, and there may have been times of temporary abandonment. But let us move on to a slightly later point in history and the construction of the Gorgan Wall. Now, this here is Fort 4. It's the largest fort on the Gorgan Wall. It's about 10 times the size of Burak Tepe, about 5.5 hectares. And you see this also here in a reconstruction drawing by Fazin Rezaian, and in aerial imagery and in our reconstruction drawing. I should incidentally point out that we now think that this reconstruction drawing from the first phase of our project is not entirely accurate. There's a strong possibility that the barracks were even significantly wider than is shown on this drawing, and the evidence for this I will present in a moment. In terms of its architecture, it is very similar to what we also see in the Roman world at a similar time. So we have forts with strongly projecting towers, no special buildings inside, but pretty much the entire area, insofar as we have evidence for accommodation, is taken up by barracks. Now, in the new phase of our project, 2014 to 2016, we thought it might be a better idea to excavate at a different fort, just to show that the results in Fort 4 apply more widely, or how they may differ at other forts. And we chose a fort of a different size category, a much smaller fort. Fort 2 is still over a hectare in size. It contained 2 barracks. It's the most common type of fort on the Gorgan Wall. You're seeing here a topographical survey and a location plan of the two trenches that we excavated. We also carried out a geophysical survey, and this geophysical survey by our Iranian colleague Dr. Kuresh Mohammadiani showed the towers of the fort very, very prominently. And it also shows the gate very clearly, but in the interior it's very, very disturbed. So we can reconstruct the defenses on the basis of our geophysical survey with a fair amount of accuracy, and we also excavated one of the towers. However, we see very, very little of the interior architecture. We know, however, from satellite images that there were the typical two barracks inside. So you see the two parallel mounds here, which are the collapsed remains of two substantial buildings in the interior of our fort. So taking all this evidence together, we now can reconstruct this fort as follows. So you see in red here the original barracks, and in blue the annexes. And we will focus in a moment very specifically on our trench here, which you see here in this part of the image, and what we have found out about occupation of our fort on the Great Wall of Gorgan. Now, this here is a close-up of the results of our excavations. Here again, obviously you see here only very small parts, so look at the image in the bottom right corner to get the bigger picture. So we see here just one row of rooms of 16 and just an area of 8 meters north to south of barracks that originally would have reached a length of around 90 meters. Our barracks were originally probably 2 stories high, and they were about 11 meters wide. But later on, if you look at the mud brick walls in blue, they were extended to widths of almost 30 meters. So a massive installation. Now, some scholars have doubted that the Gorgan Wall was or even could have been permanently occupied. I do not think that there's any longer any doubt that it was. We found a substantial amount of pottery, of animal bones. We also found ovens and fireplaces used by the occupants. We found in a total of 6 storage pits in the interior of the fort. Now you see here the earlier phases of fort occupation. I next show you the later phases of occupation. We're not going to look at this in enormous detail, but what is interesting to note is that at one stage the entire surface was raised. That was probably in the 6th century. An entire new set of ovens was constructed, 8 in total in this small area of this trench, out of I think 15 ovens and fireplaces which we've traced in total. One room was transformed into a storeroom, which large storage stars, another storage pit was stuck, and then later on we have yet another set of fireplaces. So we have dense occupation, probably over a period of roughly a century and a half. It is possible that our barracks were occupied by military families. We certainly have evidence for textile production taking place within our barracks. Wool was probably spun in the more homely central and eastern part of our barracks. And the Gorgan Wall may have been occupied by a probably fairly low maintenance army that to some extent produced their own textiles, may have been responsible also for some of their own food supply, and did not receive any payments in coinage as far as we can tell. So here, just to give you a bit more of a visual evidence, here 2 of our team members very helpfully here posed for purposes of scale in one of our storage pits. That's the largest one, so you see that it had quite a considerable capacity, and you also see here just 4 out of the 12 large insidious storage jars, and many more were found broken, which we found in the fort, and one of the big ovens which we found within our fort. So in total, there may have been something like 200 storage pits in our fort, if we assume a similar density of pits all over the fort, and a large number of storage jars, probably, and very, very many ovens and fireplaces. Now, were we lucky that we just found 2 forts in this dense occupation? In our fort, I should point out, more than 40% of the interior area was built over, and bearing in mind that part of it probably rose to 2 stories, this certainly would have provided accommodation for a substantial number of occupants. And it's even possible that there may have been further rooms along the fort walls, but we don't know yet because we haven't excavated there as yet. Now, were we just lucky is exceptional. Now, if you look at satellite imagery, you find that in all well-preserved forts, there are barracks. And they're always in even numbers, so there are either 2, or there are 4, or there are 6, or once only there are 8 barracks. What does this tell us about the size of the Sasanian army? Interesting maybe a comparison with the most famous of Roman walls, Hadrian's Wall, having been built about 300 years earlier. It was only about 2/3 of the length of the Gorgan Wall, less than half the number of large forts. The combined size of the forts was again less than half of those on the Gorgan Wall. And it's not unreasonable to assume that the garrison of the Gorgan Wall was also 2.5 to 3 times greater. So if we are right in thinking that there may have been 30,000 men or something in this order of magnitude stationed on the Gorgan Wall alone, the question arises, how large may the Sasanian army have been as a whole? I haven't been brave enough to venture a precise numerical estimate. James Howard Johnston has suggested there were 300,000, and I think he may well be right, and if anything, I would have thought that this may be at the lower range of likely numbers. The Gorgan Wall is, of course, not the only wall on the northern borders of the Sasanian Empire. Very famous is the Levant Wall, 42 kilometers long, and there are further Sasanian walls further west in the Caucasus, and particularly interesting is also the Gilgilchi Wall. You see here myself as a human scale standing in front of it, or also this horse might give you an idea of the scale. This wall still survives to a height of 7 meters. One of the towers is even surviving to a height of 10 meters. And of course, prior to the decay of the mud brick architecture, these walls would have risen to a substantially greater height than that. And that also may give us some clues as to the height of the Gorgan Wall, which of course was built of fired bricks, robbed out, and therefore it is harder to be sure about its size. The Levant Wall and the Gilgilchi Wall were also protected by forts, substantial forts in the coastal plain, small forts in the mountain sections. That is similar to the Gorgan Wall, only that the Gorgan Wall had a much longer section in the lowlands and therefore many more large forts. Now, how easy or difficult would it have been to build a barrier like this? In the Gorgan Plain, you have no stone, you have not much timber, so the only building material that is available to you in unlimited quantities is soil. So the only material that you can build your wall of is mud brick, but mud brick would not have lasted because it rains too much. So you needed fired bricks. In order to shape your mud bricks, you need water. So aqueducts had to be constructed. And you see here a drone image of an aqueduct about 20 meters high, channeling water across the Gorgan River. Remains of the collapsed brick bridge still existed in the 19th century to the Gorgan Wall and all along the lowland section of the Gorgan Wall. So you need to dig hundreds of kilometers of canals in order to build the Gorgan Wall. You also need brick kilns. We estimate that there may have been 2,000 to 5,000, each of a size of 4 to 7 meters to build the Gorgan Wall. On the right, you see yet a further brick kiln, only surviving to about half the height of its combustion chamber. Here in the center, you see a brick kiln surviving to the top of its arch, where the combustion chamber on its own was about 2 meters high. So a massive workforce, a massive, highly skilled workforce must have been employed in this construction project. And in 2014 to 15, we were also able to explore the highest preserved part of the Gorgan Wall detected to date, and that was excavated notably under the direction of Dr. Shebal Nokande. And you see here the bridge, which is surviving to a height of about 7.5 meters, but is not preserved to anywhere near its top. And it gives us an idea about the scale of the monument if so much effort was invested in plugging a weak point. How do we know that it was a bridge? Because the Gorgan Wall here detected by geophysical survey is leading straight towards this massive bridge. And there are 2 forts on either side of this bridge barrier. Bridge barriers we also find in the Caucasus, so this is a type of defensive monument that is applied more widely, and one of many indications that the Sasanian army coordinated its defensive efforts on multiple frontiers. Now, if you're getting bored with frontier wars, let me move on to what is happening in the hinterland of them. And we will look at mega fortresses of significantly greater scale than the forts on the Gorgan Wall. Now here, this will be déjà vu. We've seen this before when we looked at Burak Tepe. Here there's a Gorgan Wall again, and 2 kilometers south of it, we see here this massive campaign base, Khalichara Bay, about 650 meters across. And when we carried out a geophysical survey at this site, we found rows of rectangular enclosures in neat double rows, and this can really only be enclosure ditches around tents, resembling similar arrangements in earlier Roman marching camps. So you have soldiers living in tents or other temporary accommodation with plenty of space in the access corridors for tethering horses. So quite possibly a campaign base for the Persian field army. Now, if you're thinking that maybe I may have a little bit too much fantasy in this respect, and there may not be much evidence to support it, let me first of all just remind you of the radiocarbon dates. So this installation was again built in the 5th to early 6th century, probably actually the first half of the 5th century. And there's also written evidence that may refer to very similar installation. This here is a passage taken from the Armenian historian Elisha, and he refers here to events in the middle of the 5th century. And he describes here how the Persian general sets out with his whole heathen host, marched to Armenia, and reached the province of Her and Sarevant. That's to the northwest of Lake Urmia. Holding in that province, he pitched his camp, dug ditches. Now we have absolutely massive ditches around our site, erected a rampart. We have a massive rampart, surrounded it with a wooden palisade, and vigilantly fortified it like a city. And this fits strikingly to what we have found. A site that is heavily defended, but only tent city inside. It's not a town. If it was a town, you would expect urban amenities. You wouldn't just expect temporary enclosures around tents. And interestingly, at the same time in the Roman world, the Roman army appears to have abandoned building defended marching camps, whereas the Persians, Vegetios, a Roman writer of the 5th century, tells us, imitate the Roman practice and now build camps with ditches and ramparts out of sacks of sand. Now, I think Vegetius is right in telling us that the Persian army built camps about which we don't know very much as yet, and the campaign bases are probably a separate form. There are the more developed camps for longer stays in border territory to keep the field army secure, but there will also have been many temporary camps that are much harder to detect. I do not think that in the light of the substantial architectural differences that he is right that these were copied. This is almost certainly an independent development. If you bear in mind the architecture of our base large square compound with corner citadel, then you will have a déjà vu. This here is a very similar installation, Gabri-Calais, which we explored in the more recent phase of our project. Previously, we weren't sure about the chronology of these campaign bases. Were they built earlier or later than the Gorgan Wall? Now we know that at least some of them are earlier. At Gabri-Calais, we sectioned the entrance causeway. Our radiocarbon dating suggests it was built in the 4th or in the early 5th century, and it was built before the Gorgan Wall. Otherwise, it's strikingly similar to Calais Bay, with a corner citadel defended by 91 towers and broadly of a similar size. Indeed, there are about 4 campaign bases in the Gorgan Plain, all of a strikingly similar size of around 40 hectares each. That is about twice the size of a legionary fortress of the early empire and about 8 times the size of a legionary fortress of the late empire. But they were far from the largest fortresses within the Sasanian realm. Calais Polgonbad is the largest such geometric fortress that we do know in the Gorgan Plain. And we were very glad that an opportunity arose to explore this very important site because of its extraordinary scale and possible significance for the military history of the Gorgan Plain. So in all probability, this being the largest base in the area, this is where some of the Persian kings campaigning in the area might quite possibly have temporarily been housed. And it was also very important because this site has already partially been obliterated because it's at the outskirts of a large town and is being buried by urban sprawl. Only one corner here in the east does still survive in part, and it was here that we sectioned the moat around the site, surviving to a depth of about 8.5 meters and repeatedly recut. The wall is probably a mere shadow of its former self, but we did find charcoal embedded in the topsoil under the wall, and that was dated again to the 5th to early 7th century, with the most likely date falling actually probably in the last 3/3 of the 6th century. So it's possible that this is not only the largest of the fortresses on the Gorgan Plain, but it may also be one of the latest. But we cannot prove this beyond doubt as yet. Interestingly, so it's 125 hectares in size. Interestingly, we have one of almost identical size on the other side of the Caspian Sea, in the southeast of Russia, in Dagestan, explored by Gadzhiev, Professor Gadzhiev, and here again you see multiple tower mounts around it and strikingly similar size. Here I plot here also a late Roman legionary fortress on the same scale for purpose of comparison. Sasanian finds, such as here this bone pin, of which we found a very similar example in our own excavation at one of our sites in the Gorgan Plain. But even this site is dwarfed by Calais Gorge near Tehran. And I should here acknowledge that this site has been explored for some years by Dr. Mohammad Reza Nemati and Dr. Mehdi Musavinya. And much of what I will be presenting is based on their research, and you can read more about it in a recent article in the journal Iran. I should also acknowledge that we found, when we excavated in the southeast gate in this fort, dating evidence, and some years before, the excavations by Dr. Nemati, who you can see here on this picture, had unearthed Ostraca and Bulle. And I heard in the introduction that Professor Carlo Gereti is in the audience, and I'm extremely pleased that Professor Gereti is in the audience. He has deciphered the Ostraca. I haven't included them in this lecture because I didn't want to steal the thunder of his publication, which hopefully will appear in print in around 2 months' time. But there is very, very important written evidence for supply to this fortress via Ostraca from this very gateway, published by Professor Gereti in our forthcoming monograph, about which I will say more in a moment. But also look at this drone image will give you some idea of the scale of this massive projecting gates. So some of the small dots here are the excavators. This gate survives these fortifications generally at Dariali Gorge, survived to a height of up to 15 meters, and of course would have been even higher in antiquity. Dr. Nemati and Dr. Musavinia established correctly virtually everything about the architecture that we know about this fort. They also established correctly that it was Sasanian, so our modest contribution to the project was to refine the dating, because in our sondages we recovered various samples and submitted them for radiocarbon dating, and now we are fairly confident that this fortress was built in the early 5th century, somewhere in the first third of the 5th century, so it is also earlier than the Gorgan Wall. And it surely cannot be coincidence that what is the largest military fortress, not including fortified cities, in Iran is at one of the central crossroads of Persia, just 45 kilometers from the modern capital of Iran at Tehran. But let us move on to the Sasanian Empire's use of its natural barriers. Now, various of our linear barriers do terminate in the mountains, where it was very difficult to bypass them. That is true for the Great Wall of Gorgan, but they also led to the seashore. So Russian colleagues who explored the Derbent Wall found out that not only did it lead to the shore of the Caspian Sea at the time, but it led to deep into the water, to a water depth of about 2 meters, so it would have been impossible to bypass it by wading through shallow water. We explored the seaside terminals of our walls, the Gorgan Wall and the Tamishe Wall, also leading to the Caspian Sea, leading into the Caspian Sea, whose water table is about 3 meters higher today than it was in Sasanian times. And you see here my colleague, Dr. Jebral Nokande, who is holding one of the massive bricks, about 20 kilograms each, of which the walls were built. And we assume that you would have needed at least around 200 million of them to build the Gorgan Wall alone. Now, already in the previous phase of the project, we explored via diving operation one submerged fort on the Tamishe Wall. You see here the Tamishe Wall on land. But in our more recent phase, we were glad we could win over Dr. Richard Bates from the University of St. Andrews. And he succeeded in tracing the Gorgan Wall, in tracing the Tamishe Wall for around another kilometer into the Caspian Sea, where it may come to a terminal. He also succeeded in following the Gorgan Wall, which is also buried under marine sediments further to the west. We haven't found the terminal yet, but I think it is possible to find it in future. Water was also used for defensive purposes elsewhere in the Sasanian realm. And you will be familiar with the events of AD 363, when the Roman Emperor Julian embarked on what proved to be a suicide mission. He invaded Persia, not very successfully. And one of the tactics which the Sasanian army successfully used to impede the invasion was to use water in order to impede the progress of the invasion army. The same appears to have happened at our sites. So here we've just returned to our bridge, which you've seen in an earlier slide, and we are just in the process of excavating a part of this bridge. And one night after heavy overnight rain, the diversion channel which we needed to divert water away from our trench became blocked, and just overnight this massive reservoir was created just above our bridge. And this is very interesting because during our excavations we also found that there are alluvial deposits of around 2 meters depth next to our bridge, and we have radiocarbon dates from them which do suggest that these alluvial deposits built up in the 6th to 7th century AD. So it appears that the river was dammed to create a massive reservoir here just in the area of our bridge. And we think that one of the reasons for doing this was in order to make approaches to this potential weak point of the Gorgan Wall even more difficult. But if we want to understand how the Sasanian Empire used its natural barriers to defensive advantage, we should look at the Caucasus, where this becomes even more strikingly obvious. Here's the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, and if we move to the north of Tbilisi, we come to the most important pass through the central Caucasus in Dariali Gorge. And we see here two fortifications, Dariali Fort and Bakhtari, which is just about 1 kilometer north of Dariali Fort. And we explored those for 4 years jointly with our colleagues at Tbilisi State University. Now, Dariali Gorge was very significant, and if you doubt this, just bear in mind what Shapur I writes in his famous inscription at Nasir-Rostam, where Dariali features as prominently as entire kingdoms. And he writes, I own Iberia, that's modern East Georgia, and Albania, that's essentially Azerbaijan, up to the Caucasus, and the Gate of the Alans. And the Gate of the Alans is, of course, still the name of the gorge today. Gate, that's Persian dar or door. I, genitive marker, though the door of, al, the Alans. So the door of the Alans, the name of the gorge in the 3rd century as it is still today. This here is a painting of the 19th century of Dariali Gorge, and that might give you a better impression of how narrow it was at the time, because since, through the use of explosives, the gorge has been widened in order to make Transcaucasian traffic easier. Dariali Gorge, also known as the Caspian Gates, features arguably more prominently than any other mountain valley in the ancient and medieval sources. This here is a particularly famous passage in the Wars of Procopius. I'm not going to read it out word for word, but he refers here to an extremely narrow gorge, and there's a natural gate looking like a man-made construction called the Caspian Gates since ancient times. This was first Persian, then Ambazukas, a Han, possibly an Alan, conquered it, and then covered the first, reconquered it, probably in the early 6th century, and took possessions of the gates again. Now, this here is a drone image of what may have been the Caspian or Alan Gates. So you see these vertical cliffs, and we were very keen to get dating evidence for this and excavated a small sondage. And I would invite you, if you're not afraid of heights, to follow me up onto this cliff and join our team in exploring this mountaintop barrier. And I think from this slide it becomes clear how easy it would have been for you to control traffic across Europe's highest mountain range if you commanded the high ground at this particular point. Now, our endeavor, here also David Nashkidashvili, who has also taken all the beautiful drone images which feature in this lecture. Our endeavor was successful, and we did get radiocarbon dates which suggest that this barrier was probably built in the 4th or the early 5th century AD. It's just about 1 kilometer away from Dariali Fort, and we also explored Dariali Fort itself, excavated there quite extensively, and have from our project in Georgia more than 100 radiocarbon dates, and I'll just present you here one sequence. And this does suggest that this fort was built in the late 4th or possibly the very early 5th century AD, and then was occupied intensively for around 600 years. Now, why was it built then? It was in 395 that there was a famous raid by the Huns across Dariali Pass, affecting all those areas which are highlighted here in red. And after that, the Persians and the Romans would have had a strong incentive to pluck the weak point in the natural defenses to make such raids much more difficult. And it is interesting to note that after that, there is no similar devastating Hunnic incursion ever again. Evidence in my mind, in any case, that this was successful. The invasion of the Sabi Huns in the 6th century do not appear to affect Persia, and I would like to see them as proxy wars, where northerners are directed by the Sasanian Empire against Rome. Dariali Fort was a very small fort, only about 60 meters across, minute in comparison with some of the other forts that we have seen. But because it dominated these narrow mountain barriers, it was such a strategic asset, and it was a state-of-the-art installation supplied by water via an aqueduct with a staircase down to the river. And I think you can see it here also how well it controlled traffic via this road blocking barrier next to the fort itself. This valley would have been much deeper in antiquity. What you see here, much of it is debris which built up in the Middle Ages. But let me finally come to some historical conclusion and say a little bit more about the scale of our project. Now, I haven't yet really talked about the Sasanian defenses in the south, and I will not do so in any detail, but I should acknowledge here the work which was carried out especially by Nazar al-Javari, Derek Kennett, and Seth Priestman in the Foulage Fort, also as part of our ERC project, where we excavated a very small fort, just about 30 meters across. There are other Sasanian forts, of course, on the Persian Gulf and in the Indian Ocean, and there are further Sasanian installations, such as the famous ditch of Shapur further west. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, because, of course, eventually the fatal attack occurred from the south, it might have been wise to fortify the southern frontiers even more strongly. But in the north, certainly the Sasanian Empire cannot be excused of a lack of investment into its defenses. And it was quite well coordinated. So we see the same type of barrack forts on the Gorgan Wall as we see in Upper Mesopotamia. And there's much else common ground. We already hear about bridge barriers, for which I use here this small pink symbol, which are also built widely across the Persian world. Now, how did the system work? Now, of course, we've got here our linear barriers at some stage maybe plucking all weak points across the Caucasus and also to the east of the Caspian Sea. Then we have large campaign bases for the Sasanian army. Kali-Raj may have been pivotal, dispatching troops to sites much further afield in Transcaucasia and in the Gorgan Plain. And then we have permanent garrison along the forts. So here in yellow, we've got the barrack forts. Some of these installations survived for a long period of time. So let us return very briefly to Gabri-Calais, which you remember it was this site near Gorgan that was established in the 4th or in the early 5th century. And this one was still occupied in the late 13th or the 14th century. We do not know exactly what brought about its end. It is possible that the Black Death, which affected much of Europe and Asia in the mid-14th century, resulted in its abandonment. It's also possible that Timur may have played a part in its eventual demise. But it is interesting that our Sasanian foundation survives for about 1,000 years. And it does remind one of Roman legionary fortresses evolving into cities, of which there are numerous examples, such as, for example, Lincoln and many more, and of which there may also be many examples in the Sasanian Empire. So I'm inclined to think that Ur Kala in Azerbaijan, in Ulta Khalasi in northwest Iran, remarkably geometric, both of proven Sasanian origins, both surviving into the Middle Ages, also originated as military foundations that evolved into towns. Let us also look at a town in our area, Dasht-Kale, dating to a similar time as the Gorgan Wall, or possibly its origins slightly earlier. A massive town. We've detected a fire temple via geophysical survey, massive brick colonnades, and this in itself, I think, is evidence for healthy demography. So the Sasanian army evidently created the security that ensured inner prosperity within the Sasanian Empire. And this was made possible through massive military investment. Now here I've plotted at the same scale Sasanian and Roman installations. So the Sasanian ones are the ones in the regular font, everything on the left and top right of the image, and contemporary late Roman installation all in italics. And it's not that I've deliberately left out large late Roman fortresses, there simply are none. There are large fortress cities, I should say, but they hadn't an exclusively military garrison, therefore are not suitable. So the late Roman army doesn't build fortresses on the same scale as the Sasanian army does. It relies much more heavily on urban defenses, which are of course used in the Sasanian realm as well. So there's much heavier investment in military infrastructure in the Sasanian realm than in the Roman world, or than quite possibly in any other ancient or medieval empire in the Near East or in Europe. So let us finally return to the slide that you've seen initially. This here is the Sasanian Empire in the late 6th, early 7th century. And I would argue that it was because of the strength of its northern fortification that the Sasanian Empire was capable to recover from setbacks, such as the defeat of the 480s, and even expand further in the west in the early 7th century because these defenses secured the rear. This is what our archaeological evidence suggests. It's also what the written sources suggest. So there are theoreticians who say, well, the Huns could have very, very easily overrun the Sasanian Empire, but the fact is that they didn't. And the fact is also that, looking at the written sources, it required a prolonged siege to take Tbilisi, which is of much smaller scale, even so we don't know its complete size, than some of the other Sasanian fortifications. So Persia and her allies, her important allies in Iberia and Albania, could not very easily have been run over. This would have taken a very long time, and it is a strength of these defenses that ensured the prosperity of the Sasanian Empire, that ensured that in many territories it reached a population density that was never reached before. If you would like to read more about our project, then I should alert you to our book on jointly authored with my colleagues in Georgia about Dariali, which we published 2 years ago, and hopefully out in about 2 months. At the bottom, our book on the on our recent work in Iran, available in all good bookshops, about which they can read much more about our project. And I just would like to end by thanking everybody who has made this project possible. Notably, of course, my co-directors and co-authors, whose name you can read at the top. Our numerous supporters, notably the European Research Council and the Iranian Cultural Heritage Handicraft and Tourism Organization, and our wonderful team. And of course, also, I would like to thank you, the audience, and I would like to thank Professor Shayegan and Dr. Stevens for having made all this possible. And I would also like to thank Paul Diffley and Michael Hawke, without whose technical support, I think none of this would have been possible.